What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G. Matthews, break down all the original content you watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and on Vice. As today we're talking Season 4, Episode 5. Already 5 episodes in, that's crazy. Of Dark Side of the Ring on the Junkyard Dog. Now, he's a name I feel like everyone knows, or at least most people know. Honestly, he was someone I did not know much about beyond his in-ring stuff. And even his in-ring stuff, I only knew of him from, the old WWE video games, Legends of WrestleMania. He might have been in a SmackDown vs. Raw game here and there. I feel like he was in SVR fucking like 06 or something like that. Didn't know really much about anything as far as his actual career beyond WWE and the struggles that he faced outside of the ring and stuff like that. Really good episode here, a lot of talking heads, all of which I'll mention. They open up the episode with the induction speech, actually, for Junkyard Dog back in 2006. I think it was when he was inducted by Ernie Ladd. And they had a close connection, which I'll get into momentarily. But he was the one who inducted Junkyard into the Hall of Fame in, I think, 05, 06, or whatever it was. They talk about how he was a hero to the working class of the audience, and how fans would go after all of Junkyard's opponents, because that's how, popular he was. In the parking lot, you better not have left your car out there, because it would have gotten destroyed if you were facing Junkyard that night. He was actually originally known as Big Daddy Ritter in Calgary. That's where his career got started. And JR talks about back then, like the racism in wrestling, which was extremely prominent back then, even at that point in the 70s or whatever year it would have been exactly. Yeah, I think it would have been the 70s. A lot of the white wrestling promoters had like a black quota. If they already had a big black baby face, they're not going to hire another one. That's just how it was back then. And JR said it was terrible, and it is. And that was the problem that he faced. And a lot of the issues that he faced early on in his career was not being able to get booked because they already had, we already filled our quota for one black babyface on our roster. We don't need another one, which is so fucking dumb, but that's how it was back in the day. But JR says that he was always smiling, always an upbeat guy, very positive. Bill Watts of Mid-South Wrestling took a chance on Junkyard, feeling like he could add a lot to his product, and he did. Coco Beware said that he was far from a technical wrestler, was Junkyard. He was another one that we heard a lot from on this episode, Coco Beware. He said that he was a street fighter, and that was the style that he incorporated into his matches. So he wasn't really a great wrestler per se, but he could connect with an audience. Tony Atlas said that. And Mid-South was based on the realism, so it was kind of a good fit anyway. Ernie Ladd was actually Bill Watts' booker and had an eye for talent, and he was the one who scouted Junkyard. So that was the connection between the two, like I mentioned earlier. And they didn't know that he wasn't great technically, but that didn't stop them from using him because he was so popular and he was really good at, like I said, with connecting with the audience. And he was booked in matches that fit his style. If his opponents could kind of carry him to a technical or just a good match, that was all that really mattered. So his opponents really protected him to a great degree and did a good job doing so, including Ted DiBiase. Ted DiBiase was really close with him. He said that Junkyard could do anything with the right opponent, and they highlighted his stuff really, really well. They were so close, actually, that JYD was DiBiase's best man at DiBiase's wedding, which is pretty crazy. So obviously he was, they talk about it later, but he was pretty devastated when he heard about his passing in 95. So, was it 95? I think they said it was 95 or around there. But anyway, Bill Watts made him look like an absolute star. He made him an absolute star in his promotion, and he looked at him as family as well. Cornette says, who was on this episode a little bit, this is now 4 out of 5 episodes so far this season that Cornette was on, and he's a wrestling historian, it makes sense. He was not on the Doink episode, but he was on every other episode so far, including this one. And he recalls the angle where he was blinded by the Freebirds. Now, I've heard this story before, not this exact story he's about to tell, but about the storyline. I think they talked about it on Tales from the Territories, and how can you not repeat it here, because it's an iconic storyline in his career. But I think I heard it not too long ago on the Tales from the Territory episode on Mid-South. I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, so it led to a dog collar match, the famous dog collar match between Michael P.S. Hayes and Junkyard Dog. And he almost had to stop a fan, did Junkyard, while he was blinded, because this guy had a gun. And he had to, all right, do I stop this guy and risk ruining kayfabe, or do I just leave it be and keep kayfabe and this guy could kill someone with his gun? Thankfully, it didn't get to that point. But he literally went out in public acting blinded because he wanted to keep kayfabe. Teddy Long, who we also hear from a lot on this episode, says that Junkyard was a huge draw. He was very generous with his time and with the fans and stuff like that. He was great with the fans. We hear from his nephew Jarvis, who said that, or not said, but we go to where Junkyard and Jarvis grew up. I don't know if he lived with him for a time, I don't remember, but they go to where he grew up, which is pretty cool. He said that he stayed humble, never changed, but being on the road took a toll on him. And he had a daughter, he had family. Jake Roberts, who we also hear from a fair share amount on this episode, he said that they both experimented with drugs at that point. That was kind of like the gateway for Jake to kind of start doing it as well. Specifically speed, he said. Jarvis remembers him doing it and said that Junkyard told him, listen, if I ever catch you doing this, you're fucking dead, pretty much. And Jarvis said, all right, understood, but that didn't stop JYD from doing it. They talked about how he would sleep with groupies for money, like people would literally pay him to sleep with him, I guess, and that was one way he made money. Tony Atlas actually recalls a story where he would fight one of the girls' husbands because the husband came in and he was all pissed, obviously, and he fucking beat the shit out of the husband, and the girl stayed with JYD, which is just hysterical. Eventually, his popularity became so big, he caught the attention of Vince McMahon. And Vince ended up offering JYD double of what he was making in Mid-South in 1994, so he went to WWF for the money. And obviously, it broke Bill Watts' heart. He addressed the departure on air, not really breaking kayfabe, but that kind of told you how big of a deal it was to Bill Watts. And it was. I mean, this guy was very loyal to him, made him a star, and then he left. Hard to blame him for the money he was making, but he kind of just went to where the money was being made, and it really fractured their relationship, needless to say. So Teddy Long recalls a story where JYD was sitting, I think, in a stall, in a bathroom stall, and he heard Bill Watts talking to Grizzly Smith, who actually had his own episode of Dark Side of the Ring a few years ago. So he recalls a conversation that JYD was hearing from the bathroom stall, and they didn't know he was in the stall. And he said that JYD heard Bill Watts call JYD the N-word to Grizzly Smith. And that pissed off JYD to the point where he didn't feel bad about leaving. Let's put it that way. And Bill Watts, isn't he now dead? I don't remember, but I'm honestly not sure if Bill Watts is dead. I think he is, but I don't remember. But they flashed up a graphic at that point from Bill Watts, or from his perspective, just saying that he denies the story and calls it complete fiction. So he denies that it ever happening. That was Teddy's story from JYD's perspective. I don't know if he told him that or he heard it through someone else. But Bill Watts' perspective was that it never happened. So I guess that's what it is. Not that it didn't happen or didn't happen, but that's all they say on that. And so Mid-South attempted to bring in other black wrestlers to fill the void, but no one could fill in his shoes, including even Butch Reed. Famous wrestler Butch Reed, they tried with him. All good talents. No one was the talent that JYD was. And JR praises. He said, listen, Vince did a great job marketing JYD. He made a ton of money on action figures, was featured in cartoons, and even on the fucking album they did at that point. He was a massive, massive star. More so probably in WWE than in Mid-South as far as more people getting to know him and being on a grander scale. I feel like if anyone today knows who Junkyard Dog is, it's probably from the time he spent in WWE, not fucking Mid-South, unless they grew up in that area, if that makes sense. So, for as popular as he was in WWE, he couldn't capture the same heights that he had in Mid-South. He just wasn't the main event star. And Jarvis doesn't think that the business was ready for a guy like him in WWE at that point to make him the top, black wrestler in the company. They just weren't pushing black performers at that level around that time that they are. I mean, even now there's issues with that, but they're far more progressive now than they were, 40, 50 years ago. He just thinks that the business wasn't ready for a guy like him in that spot, and Coco Beware doesn't think that WWE wanted him in that top spot, which is kind of why he stayed where he was for so many years. Tony says that Vince wanted all the nationalities represented, and I don't know if he's saying that Vince wasn't racist, but they had Samoans on top, and I mean, there's a lot of other evidence to argue otherwise, but he said, they had Backlund, but he was the only white guy on top, which he neglected to mention fucking Hulk Hogan, but I guess he's talking about one specific time period, even though Junkyard Dog came in the same year that fucking Hogan won the WWE title. Anyway, I mean, Hogan was their top babyface. They weren't going to move away from him, I guess, which is why Junkyard, probably a big reason why he never won the championship, or was never going to even get to that level, was because Hogan, it was the Hogan territory at that point. But anyway, so Jarvis said, the nephew, said that it affected JYD. He was led to believe that it affected him, and it led to more drugs of him doing more drugs, and specifically cocaine. He did it everywhere. He had no fucking public. He had no shame. He would do it in public. He didn't give a shit. He was consumed by the drug addiction. So he ended up getting fired from WWF for no-showing. And I don't know if it was Tony or someone else. Hacksaw was also in this episode too. Again, like I said, a lot of talking heads. They said that, if you were doing drugs back then, who gives a shit? I mean, obviously that we found out in the last episode that Matt Bourne got fired for drug use, which is saying something because everyone was doing drugs at that point. If you were doing drugs back in the 80s and shit, Vince didn't give a shit as long as you made your towns and whatnot and showed up. He didn't show up. He was no show and show, so they had to let him go. So we got an offer to join WCW. Bill Watts was in charge at that point. So they don't really go into the relationship and how that affected their working relationship. I mean, he didn't get, I don't know if he got fired again or what happened, because they also talk about soon after that he would go into isolation until he needed the money, because he just wasn't the same guy anymore. And he would do indie shows whenever he needed the money. When he got the money, he would disappear for a while. It got to a point in the 90s, the early 90s before he passed, he had to work a part-time job at a local Walmart. So again, I don't know what happened with the WCW tenure. Maybe they talked about how it ended. I'm sure he got fired or whatever. Maybe the Bill Watts thing happened. He just didn't want him there. I don't know. I mean, he was popular. He just wasn't the same guy, and he looked physically different. He looked bloated, a lot more so than back in the day. So, and they also said that he was very careless with money. And DiBiase felt like he became a changed man at the very end of his life when he talked to DiBiase, and he was doing like these, not church visits, but he would do like these public speaking talks and stuff. DiBiase wouldn't, and still does, I think, about like religious stuff and whatever, and talking to kids and encouraging them to make the right decisions, blah, blah, blah. And he told DiBiase to tell the kids not to do what he did. So DiBiase thinks, he said at the end of the episode, that he kind of started to turn his life around and was going to when he told him that. If he was well aware of the issues he was making and all the issues that he had, then that told him he still had a lot of good left in him. He just didn't know how to, stop doing the drugs or whatever. So anyway, he was determined to make it to his daughter's graduation, her high school graduation, and he ended up missing it. He didn't make it in time. He had to drive there, and he missed it. But he went back to their house afterward, and he spent some time with the family. And then Jarvis, and they were at a gas station or whatever, and Jarvis was with him. He noticed some puke on the inside of JYD's car, on the inside of the car door. He was like, what the fuck is this from? He's like, oh, I don't know if that was from him. I assume it was from him doing drugs or pills or drinking or whatever the fuck it was, but he threw up on the inside of the car. And he let him back on the road. He was like, oh, I'll be back in a couple days. I'll be back on Monday or something like that. Be back in a few days. So he got back on the car, and I think this was June 1st, 98, they say. Jericho, the narrator, had explained it was June 1st, 1998, a day before my birthday, actually. I was born in 95, but, I was born on June 2nd. So anyway, he got back on the road, and they find out the next day the mom calls Jarvis to tell him that JYD was killed in a car accident. So apparently what happened was he fell asleep while driving, and this was very early in the morning, so clearly he drove all night. He fell asleep at the wheel, and he drove off the road. And they find out from the autopsy that it was head trauma that killed him. So Roberts, Jake the Snake, when he talks about, everyone's talking about like finding out about his death and the reaction and whatever, he said that he was happy, if anything else, that his pain was over. That GYD's pain was over because, he'd been in pain for a long time. Watts commented on the passing. We hear comments from him. Again, I don't know if Watts is still alive or not. He wasn't on this episode physically. They just used old footage, or rather audio, of him talking about JYD's passing from, I guess, either soon after it happened or in the last 10, 15 years or whatever. I don't remember. But we also find out, this is so fucking heartbreaking, but they show his gravesite that DiBiase goes to, Jarvis goes to the gravesite. And he shows that the daughter, whose high school graduation he was attempting to attend before he passed, also actually died at the age of 31, which is pretty fucking sad, due to a ruptured heart valve, which is just terrible. And it was something that couldn't even be avoided. So she's buried right next to JYD. Again, just terrible. And they just talk about his legacy and how being organic was what made him special. And they show his Hall of Fame induction, I think from 05 or 06, like I mentioned. So, yeah, just a really good episode. I thought this was, again, I hate saying it was a great episode when they talk about all the sad stuff, but learned a lot about JYD that I did not know about before. A lot of great talking heads, and the Bill Watts stuff was interesting, and he came up at a time when he really had no business being as over as he was, as far as like who the business was pushing and focusing on at that point. Spoiler alert, it largely was not African-American people, but he got over at that point in spite of all of that, became a big star in the territories, and WWE should have been a bigger star than he was, but still a very memorable character, if nothing else. And they still, talk about him and feature him in games and stuff like that, but still, at the time that he was there, he should have been a bigger star than he was. But a really good episode, well recommended, the Junkyard Dog edition of The Dark Side of the Ring. So I think the next episode is entitled The Tragic Pass, or not passing, but The Tragic Fall of Adrian Adonis. That's coming up next week. Looking forward to watching that one. Thank you guys for checking out my review. I appreciate it. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Collision review should be coming up a little bit later today, so keep an eye out for that. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.